In the county records of eastern Louisiana, the estate appeared ordinary. Its acreage was measured, its yields recorded, its taxes paid with the same punctuality as neighboring plantations. Cotton left its fields in pressed bales. Sugar cane followed in season. On paper, nothing distinguished it from dozens of other properties that lined the river and fed the same markets. What did not appear in those records were the children. They were not listed as inventory, at least not at first. They were not mentioned in ledgers beside livestock or tools. They were noticed instead in passing, by a merchant who paused too long at the gate, by a visiting cousin who asked a question and was quietly redirected, by a preacher who chose not to look too closely during Sunday prayers. The children had light hair. Some had eyes that reflected the sky more than the soil. Their skin did not match the women who carried them, nor did it resemble the laborers who worked the fields from dawn to dusk. They stood out not because they were treated differently, but because they were not spoken about at all. On this estate, silence did the work that words could not. The plantation sat slightly inland, shielded from the main road by a stretch of oaks whose branches curved inward like an archway. Visitors who arrived rarely stayed long. Business was handled efficiently, meals were polite, and departures were timely. Nothing was encouraged that might require explanation. Those who lived there learned early what not to ask. Among the enslaved population, the pattern was recognized long before it was understood. Women would disappear from the quarters at night, not regularly, not predictably, but often enough to be noticed. They would return before morning, quieter than before, more careful in their movements. No one asked where they had gone. No one spoke of what had happened. Not because it was unknown, but because it was known too well to name. And then there were the children. They were born in the same cabins, delivered by the same hands, wrapped in the same cloth. But as they grew, difference emerged. Hair that lightened instead of darkened. Features that mirrored no one around them. Eyes that caused strangers to look twice. At first, the overseer attempted to explain it away. Whether he said, nutrition. A peculiarity of bloodlines he did not understand. But explanation requires repetition, and repetition invites scrutiny. Over time, the explanations grew shorter. Eventually they stopped. The plantation owner did not deny the children existed. He simply never acknowledged them directly. He allowed them to remain among the enslaved, but never close to the main house. He made sure they were clothed plainly, worked early, and were never idle where guests might notice them too clearly. Visibility on this estate was managed as carefully as output. There were rules, though none were written. The children were not to be taught to read. They were not to be assigned indoor work. They were not to be spoken of by name in front of visitors. If questioned, laborers were instructed to say nothing at all, or to speak of unrelated matters until the moment passed. Silence became a shared language. For the women who gave birth to these children, the silence was heavier. They carried not only the labor of the fields but the weight of knowing their children would never be allowed to belong fully anywhere. Too different to disappear, too controlled to escape notice. Yet the system persisted because it was not designed to make sense. It was designed to continue. Within the estate's boundaries, the children grew. Some learned to lower their eyes. Some learned to keep their voices flat and unremarkable. A few learned to make themselves useful in ways that discouraged attention. Survival here was not about strength or rebellion, it was about becoming uninteresting. And still people noticed. Travelers passing through the region began to whisper. A trader mentioned seeing odd-looking children working a field. A riverboat hand asked why a particular boy had hair lighter than any free man he knew. Each time the question reached the edge of the estate and stopped. No answer followed. The plantation did not deny. It absorbed. What made this estate different was not that such children existed. History would later reveal that they existed in many places, but that here they appeared repeatedly, across years, across seasons, with a consistency that could not be attributed to chance. Patterns invite attention. Attention invites risk. Inside the quarters, the women began to notice that the children were treated with a particular caution. They were punished like everyone else but never publicly. They were worked hard but never placed where outsiders might observe them closely. It was not protection. It was containment. One woman, older than the rest, remarked once that the children were kept like evidence no one wanted to examine. Her words passed quietly from mouth to mouth, never spoken near walls that might listen. The enslaved men noticed something else. These children were watched differently. Overseers counted them twice. The owner asked after their whereabouts more often than he asked about crop totals. When one child fell ill, a doctor was summoned, not out of mercy but out of urgency. The estate did not want questions that could not be answered. Years passed. Children became adolescents. Adolescents became laborers whose presence could no longer be hidden by distance or dismissal. Their faces hardened. Their features settled into something unmistakable. And with that clarity came tension. The plantation began to adjust. Assignments shifted. Certain cabins were moved farther from the road. Work schedules changed. Visitors were guided along paths that avoided particular fields. Every adjustment was small, defensible on its own. Together they formed a structure built not on denial but on management. The owner understood something his neighbors pretended not to. Exposure was not dangerous because it revealed cruelty. It was dangerous because it revealed contradiction. These children did not fit the story the plantation told about itself. They disrupted the illusion that power flowed cleanly in one direction. They made visible what was meant to remain private. Their very existence challenged the boundaries that kept the system intact. And so the estate responded the only way it knew how, by tightening control without explanation. By the time local rumors reached the county seat, they had softened into curiosities. By the time they reached the capital, they were little more than anecdotes. Systems like this did not rely on secrecy alone. They relied on fatigue, on the exhaustion of asking questions that led nowhere. Within the plantation, however, the questions did not disappear. They deepened. The women began to watch the children differently, not with distance, but with recognition. The men grew more attentive to patterns of movement after dark. The children themselves, as they matured, began to notice what was withheld from them and why. Understanding did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments, in glances exchanged, in rules that made no sense until they suddenly did. The estate had produced something it could not fully control. And as the children grew older and their resemblance became impossible to dismiss, the silence that had protected the plantation for years began to strain, quietly, invisibly, under the weight of what it was being asked to contain. When silence began to take shape, silence does not remain empty forever. On the estate, it had functioned for years as a kind of shelter, thin, fragile, but effective enough to keep questions from becoming confrontations. People learned how to live inside it, how to speak around it, how to let it absorb what could not be said aloud. But silence, once understood, changes character. It stops being absence. It becomes structure. For the children, understanding arrived unevenly. Some noticed early, others much later. It came through small moments, a remark cut short, a sudden reassignment, a hand placed firmly on a shoulder at the wrong time. It came through the realization that certain paths were never open to them, no matter how well they worked or how quietly they behaved. They were not being punished. They were being managed. One boy, old enough to be trusted with tools but not with proximity, learned this when he was moved from the mill to a far field without explanation. He had done nothing wrong. His work was steady. His presence, however, had become inconvenient. He did not ask why. He already knew. Another child, a girl with hair lighter than her mother's and eyes that unsettled strangers, was instructed never to enter the main yard when visitors were present. She learned to listen for footsteps, to read the rhythm of the house she was not allowed to approach. Her world was mapped by absence. For the women, silence had always been heavier. They carried it not only in what they did not say, but in what they were required to remember. They watched their children grow into forms that demanded explanation while being denied one. They learned to prepare them, not for freedom but for caution. They taught them when to speak. More importantly, they taught them when not to. At night, conversations shifted. Still quiet, still careful, but more deliberate. Women compared experiences without naming them directly. Men noted patterns of movement, of supervision, of sudden attention from overseers when certain children were nearby. No one accused. Accusation was dangerous. Instead, they described. Did you notice who was sent away today? Did you see who the doctor was called for? Did you hear which cabin was checked twice last night? Description became a way to share understanding without declaring it. And gradually, a truth formed, not as a revelation but as an alignment of observations. The children were not anomalies. They were outcomes. This understanding did not provoke immediate resistance. It provoked recalibration. People adjusted how they moved, how they worked, how they protected one another. Mothers became more vigilant, not just with their own children but with others. They arranged tasks so certain children were never alone at night. They found reasons to keep them occupied, present, visible within safe boundaries. Men began to time their movements differently, lingering where they were not expected to linger, creating presence without confrontation. They learned that authority depended on predictability. They disrupted it subtly. The plantation responded with increased oversight, but not explanation. Overseers were instructed to watch more closely, to account for movements, to tighten routines. Yet these measures revealed something important. Control was reactive. It responded to shifts rather than preventing them. The children noticed this first. They realized that rules were not fixed truths but tools, applied unevenly, adjusted when challenged by circumstance. They learned which rules were enforced strictly and which existed mainly for appearance. This knowledge changed how they endured. They did not rebel. They adapted. One boy learned to slow his work when attention became too focused, to appear unremarkable when curiosity surfaced. Another learned to perform obedience so convincingly it discouraged scrutiny. A girl learned to lower her head at the right moment, not from submission but from calculation. Silence, for them, became something they could shape. It was no longer merely endured. It was used. The plantation's greatest misconception was assuming that quiet meant compliance. In reality, quiet had become a space of negotiation, internal, unspoken, but active. Understanding also reached beyond the children. Those who worked alongside them began to see the plantation differently, not as a fixed hierarchy, but as a system constantly compensating for its own contradictions. They saw how effort was not rewarded consistently, how visibility could be dangerous, how difference was not punished directly but isolated. This understanding altered loyalty. People stopped investing emotionally in authority. They stopped expecting coherence. They began conserving themselves. The estate still functioned. Work was done. Orders were followed. On the surface, nothing had changed. But beneath that surface, belief was thinning. The owner sensed this, though he could not name it. He felt it in the way people answered questions more precisely than necessary, in the way compliance arrived without engagement. He increased inspections. He reminded overseers of consequences. Yet authority, once questioned internally, loses its weight long before it loses its force. The children, now older, began to recognize one another not just as individuals, but as a group shaped by the same condition. They did not gather openly. They did not speak of shared origins. But they noticed how their experiences aligned. This recognition did something subtle but profound. It removed isolation. Isolation is one of control's strongest tools. Once it weakens, control must become louder to compensate. The plantation was not prepared for this shift. It had been built to manage individuals, not shared understanding. It had no language for addressing something that did not announce itself. Silence, once a shield for the estate, was becoming its vulnerability. People were learning how to exist within it without surrendering to it. And as that understanding settled, not explosively but patiently, the plantation moved closer to a threshold it did not yet recognize. A point where silence would no longer simply contain truth, but carry it. When understanding began to travel. Understanding does not move like noise. It does not announce itself or demand attention. It moves the way habits do, quietly, gradually, almost invisibly. On the estate, it began to pass from person to person not through explanation, but through adjustment. Work patterns shifted first. Tasks that once followed strict routines began to change subtly. People lingered longer in groups. Certain children were rarely left alone. Night movements became less predictable, not chaotic but deliberately varied. No single action was suspicious. Together they altered the plantation's rhythm. Overseers noticed inefficiency but could not locate cause. Crops were still harvested. Quotas were met. Discipline appeared intact. Yet something essential was slipping beyond their reach: predictability. Understanding had begun to travel. It moved between households through observation rather than conversation. A woman noticed how another arranged her children near dusk. A man observed who lingered near which cabins. No instructions were given. No plans were shared. People simply recognized patterns that worked and repeated them. Silence became collaborative. The children sensed this change more keenly than anyone else. They began to recognize protection not as a single person's effort, but as a shared condition. They noticed how adults positioned themselves nearby without explanation, how tasks were reassigned to keep them visible, how attention was redirected when overseers approached. This visibility was strategic. It made disappearance difficult. The plantation had relied on separation, on keeping people compartmentalized enough that nothing collective could form. But understanding dissolves compartments. It reveals how experiences connect. For the first time, the children were not navigating alone. They did not speak openly about what linked them. They did not need to. Their shared difference had already taught them how to read environments closely. Now they applied that skill collectively. They learned which spaces were safest at which times, which adults could be relied upon for proximity, which signals, small gestures, pauses, changes in posture, meant attention was shifting. This was not rebellion. It was coordination without command. The estate began to feel it as resistance without a face. Orders were followed, but not with urgency. Tasks were completed, but not optimized. When problems arose, solutions emerged from unexpected places, quietly, efficiently, without drawing attention to those who provided them. Authority depends on visibility. It depends on knowing where influence originates. Here, influence had no identifiable source. The owner sensed something was wrong long before he could articulate it. Reports from overseers described a growing difficulty in maintaining order, though no infractions could be named. Punishments increased briefly, then receded when they failed to produce clarity. Punishment without purpose breeds caution, not compliance. People adjusted further. They learned when to appear indifferent, when to seem unaware, when to offer just enough obedience to avoid escalation. The plantation was no longer shaping behavior. Behavior was shaping how authority was expressed. And authority began to show its limits. Efforts to isolate certain children intensified. Assignments were altered again. Monitoring increased around specific areas. But these measures only confirmed what people already understood, that those children mattered in ways the system could not admit. Attention once drawn does not easily withdraw. By attempting to manage visibility, the plantation revealed anxiety. That anxiety traveled too. People noticed how certain names were spoken more often, how certain absences were investigated more thoroughly, how certain mistakes triggered disproportionate response. The system was telling on itself. Women who had once endured silence alone now understood its collective power. They realized that what they withheld, information, reaction, emotion, shaped outcomes. Silence was no longer passive. It was chosen. This choice altered relationships. People became more deliberate about whom they trusted with proximity. They invested in presence rather than speech. They learned that solidarity did not require agreement, only alignment. The estate had never anticipated alignment without declaration. It relied on the assumption that unity required communication it could overhear or disrupt. Understanding bypassed that vulnerability. As weeks passed, overseers began reporting exhaustion. They could not track everything. They could not predict behavior. They could not identify leaders to discipline. The plantation structure, designed to manage individuals, was failing to respond to collective awareness. In response, authority leaned harder on visibility. Inspections increased. Schedules tightened. Curfews were enforced more strictly. But visibility cuts both ways. As oversight intensified, so did observation. People saw more clearly how decisions were made, how rules were applied inconsistently, how fear guided policy. This clarity further weakened belief. The children watched all of this closely. They learned that their existence was not just inconvenient, it was destabilizing. Not because of who they were, but because of what they revealed, that the system's control depended on secrecy and fragmentation. Once understanding traveled, secrecy lost effectiveness. The estate stood on a quiet edge, not of revolt, but of exposure. Not public, not dramatic, but internal. People were no longer asking why the children looked different. They were asking what else the plantation had been hiding. And more importantly, what else could be endured differently once it was understood. When control tried to make itself visible. Control, when it senses erosion, often mistakes visibility for strength. On the estate, authority responded not with reform or retreat, but with presence. More rules were spoken aloud. More inspections were announced. More bodies appeared in places where silence had once been allowed to operate on its own. The plantation did not yet understand what it was facing. It believed the problem was looseness, too much quiet, too much movement unchecked, too much familiarity forming between people who should remain isolated. So it tightened. Schedules were revised and posted more clearly. Curfews were enforced with emphasis. Overseers were instructed to be seen rather than merely effective. The main yard, once used sparingly, became a site of regular gathering and instruction. Authority stepped into the light, and in doing so it revealed itself. For the first time in years, punishments were made visible, not necessarily harsher but more public. Infractions that once might have been handled quietly were now addressed in front of others. The goal was not correction but reminder. Power wanted to be witnessed. Yet witnessing cuts both ways. As people were gathered more often, they began to see patterns previously hidden by distance. They noticed who was singled out for scrutiny and who was not. They noticed how certain children drew attention without explanation, how their presence triggered a tightening of posture among overseers. Visibility exposed selectivity. The children especially learned quickly what this new posture meant. They felt eyes on them more often. They were asked questions that had no correct answers. They were moved from task to task under the pretense of efficiency, though no efficiency was gained. This attention was meant to intimidate. Instead, it clarified. It confirmed what understanding had already suggested, that control was not confident, that it reacted, that it adjusted based on fear of what might surface rather than what had occurred. The women responded first, not through protest but through presence. They arranged themselves near the children more consistently. They took on tasks that allowed proximity. They filled spaces authority wanted to isolate. This was not defiance. It was occupation. Men did the same in subtler ways, remaining nearby under the guise of work, adjusting routines so that no one was ever truly alone when attention intensified. The plantation responded with discipline. Warnings were issued. Threats were implied. The tone of instruction hardened. But still, no clear infraction could be named. Everything being done was technically permitted. Control was encountering a problem it was not designed to solve. It could punish action. It could not punish awareness. The owner, increasingly uneasy, demanded reports. Overseers responded with vague language, lack of compliance, declining respect, difficulty maintaining authority. None could point to a single source. There was no leader to isolate. No plan to dismantle. Only a pattern of behavior that no longer aligned with expectation. An expectation once unmet repeatedly loses force. In response, the plantation escalated further. Night patrols increased. Movement between quarters was restricted. Work assignments became more rigid. The goal was to fracture the quiet coordination that had formed. But coordination does not require freedom. It requires understanding. People adjusted again. They learned new rhythms. They adapted to patrol schedules. They found ways to remain visible enough to avoid suspicion while still protecting one another. The children learned to read authority's mood. They sensed when attention was performative rather than targeted. They learned when to remain still and when to blend into routine. Authority, meanwhile, grew louder. Orders were repeated more often. Instructions were clarified excessively. Punishments were justified publicly. These justifications were revealing. They exposed the plantation's logic, how it explained itself, how it rationalized inconsistencies, how it framed obedience as virtue rather than necessity. People listened, and what they heard did not inspire belief. The estate had always depended on the assumption that its power was natural, unquestionable, inevitable. By explaining itself, it admitted contingency. By enforcing visibility, it admitted vulnerability. The moment of exposure came quietly. One evening, an overseer attempted to isolate a child for questioning. The reason given was vague: misplacement, confusion, disorder. The child was not accused of wrongdoing, only of being inconvenient. Before the removal could occur, several adults happened to be present. Not in protest. Not in confrontation. Simply present. They did not block the action. They watched. They asked clarifying questions. They waited. The overseer hesitated, not because he lacked authority, but because authority requires certainty. And certainty was absent. Nothing happened. The child remained. No punishment followed. Word spread, not dramatically but steadily. People noted that authority had paused, that it had recalculated, that it had retreated without explanation. This moment mattered, not because it changed policy, but because it changed expectation. People understood now that authority could be stalled, that it could be made to hesitate, that it depended on isolation and speed, on acting before understanding could align. From that point forward, control felt heavier, not stronger. Every attempt to assert it revealed how much effort was required to sustain it. The plantation's leadership mistook resistance for stubbornness. They responded with more rules, more presence, more force. But force does not restore belief. It only accelerates disengagement. People complied outwardly, but inwardly they withdrew further. They conserved energy. They stopped anticipating authority's needs. They did only what was required, and nothing more. The estate still functioned, but it no longer felt inevitable. Its power had boundaries now, visible, tested, quietly acknowledged. And once boundaries are known, they shape behavior permanently. The children noticed something else too, the fear behind the force. They saw how closely they were watched, how carefully their movements were tracked. They realized their existence had become a problem authority could not solve without revealing too much. They did not celebrate this. They adapted to it. Understanding had moved from observation to strategy. The plantation had shown its hand. And in doing so, it had confirmed what silence had been teaching all along. That power, once forced into visibility, is never as absolute as it believes. When force could no longer restore belief. Force is most effective when belief still exists. On the plantation, belief had been eroding quietly for years. But now, after authority revealed its limits, something more fundamental changed. People did not become defiant. They did not organize revolts. They did not confront power directly. They disengaged. This withdrawal was subtle enough that those in control did not recognize it at first. Work still happened. Fields were tended. Orders were followed. The routines of the estate continued to operate on the surface. But the spirit that once made those routines efficient, predictable, self-sustaining, was gone. People began doing only what was explicitly required. No more anticipation. No more voluntary adjustment. No more silent effort to make the system run smoothly. Tasks that once flowed now stalled. Not because anyone refused, but because no one compensated. When tools broke, they stayed broken longer. When instructions were unclear, no one guessed the intention. When mistakes occurred, they were corrected only when noticed, never preemptively. This was not resistance. It was absence. Authority responded the only way it knew how, with escalation. Punishments increased in frequency, though not necessarily in severity. Warnings were delivered more often. The language of discipline grew sharper, more insistent. But the effect was diminishing. Each act of force now required explanation. Each explanation revealed strain. Each strain reinforced the understanding that authority was working harder to maintain what once came easily. Overseers grew exhausted. They spent more time monitoring than managing. They repeated orders that had once been understood implicitly. The owner demanded accountability. Reports multiplied. Meetings extended late into the night. Control became labor. And labor, when unreciprocated, drains quickly. The children were central to this shift, though they never acted deliberately. Their presence, watched, monitored, managed, consumed disproportionate attention. They required explanations that could never be written down. They disrupted the plantation's internal logic simply by existing. Every decision involving them carried risk. So decisions were delayed. Delay became normal. Normality began to fracture. Meanwhile, the adults learned something else. Force no longer guaranteed compliance beyond the moment it was applied. Punishment produced stillness, not belief. Silence, not loyalty. People waited out consequences rather than internalizing them. This changed everything. Because systems like the plantation rely not just on obedience but on internal alignment, on people believing, at some level, that participation makes sense. That alignment was gone. The women, especially, adjusted their behavior in ways authority did not anticipate. They stopped offering emotional responses. They stopped reacting visibly to discipline. They stopped pleading. They became unreadable. This unsettled those in control more than anger ever could. Force depends on feedback. Without it, power loses orientation. Men followed suit, though differently. They became meticulous. They followed instructions exactly, even when those instructions led to inefficiency or contradiction. If told to prioritize speed, they did so at the expense of quality. If told to prioritize order, they slowed everything down. Always compliant. Never helpful. The plantation's output declined, not catastrophically but noticeably. Margins tightened. Delays increased. Small failures accumulated. Authority blamed laziness. But laziness looks different. This was precision. And precision without intention is devastating to any system built on assumed cooperation. Attempts were made to restore morale, rare acknowledgments, minor concessions, superficial kindness. These gestures landed flat. People had learned something essential, that authority acted strategically, not benevolently. That any kindness offered could be withdrawn at will. Trust, once broken, does not return on command. The estate began to feel hollow. Not empty, but uninvested. Its structures remained intact, but their meaning had thinned. Rules existed without consensus. Power functioned without legitimacy. And legitimacy, once lost, cannot be enforced. The owner sensed decay but misunderstood its source. He believed stricter enforcement would correct drift. He authorized further crackdowns, more oversight, tighter movement controls, stricter discipline. Each measure accelerated withdrawal. People complied faster, but with less care. Children grew quieter, more observant. They learned to disappear into routine, to become unremarkable when watched and present only when safe. They learned patience, and patience, when shared, becomes endurance. One by one, small pillars of the plantation's culture collapsed. Not dramatically, just quietly. Songs stopped circulating. Stories were no longer shared freely. Communal moments thinned. People conserved energy. They saved it for one another. The plantation could no longer extract more than labor. It no longer shaped thought. It no longer inspired fear strong enough to sustain belief. Fear alone is expensive. It requires constant replenishment. And the estate was running out of resources. The final realization came too late. Authority noticed that even punishments had lost their effect. People endured them without change. There was no improvement afterward. No renewed diligence. Only return. Return to minimal compliance. Return to silence. Return to inward focus. The system was still operating, but it was no longer reproducing itself. No new belief was being formed. No loyalty was being inherited. What survived now lived outside authority's reach, within memory, within shared understanding, within quiet adaptation. The plantation had failed to erase what had been learned. And learning, once internalized, does not require permission. As cracks widened, leadership grew desperate, not for control but for explanation. They wanted to know why things no longer worked. But the answer was simple. People no longer believed the plantation was inevitable. They saw it as contingent, temporary, endurable, but not permanent. Withdrawal had done what rebellion could not. It hollowed power out from the inside. And what remained, rules, routines, force, were shells. Still standing, but no longer alive. What outlived authority? Power often believes its greatest threat is exposure. On the plantation, exposure had indeed changed everything, but not in the way authority feared. There was no public reckoning. No outside intervention. No dramatic collapse that could be pointed to as a singular moment of failure. Instead, the plantation failed in a quieter, more permanent way. What it lost was not secrecy. It lost continuity. Long after punishments had been enforced, long after oversight intensified, long after discipline was refined and reapplied, something essential no longer returned. Belief did not regenerate. And without belief, power becomes a performance, one that exhausts itself over time. The children were the clearest evidence of this failure. They grew up inside the system but not of it. They learned early that appearances mattered more than truth, that authority depended on silence, that survival required observation, not obedience. They memorized routines without internalizing meaning. They understood rules without accepting legitimacy. They watched how adults navigated danger, not through confrontation but through calculation, through patience, through selective visibility. These lessons did not need to be taught explicitly. They were absorbed through daily life, through what was avoided, through what was left unsaid. And they stayed. As older generations aged, the plantation expected transmission, of habits, of acceptance, of resignation. But what passed down was something else entirely. Children inherited discernment. They learned where power ended and where it merely pretended to continue. They learned that silence could be strategic, that compliance could be partial, that withdrawal could protect more than resistance ever could. They learned that authority relied on them more than they relied on authority. This realization was never spoken aloud. It didn't need to be. It lived in posture, in timing, in restraint. The plantation noticed, eventually, that new generations behaved differently. They were harder to intimidate, not because they were defiant but because they were internally oriented. Punishment did not reframe their understanding. It confirmed it. Authority tried adapting. Overseers changed tactics. The owner adjusted expectations. Control became less rigid in some places, harsher in others. But none of it restored what had been lost. Because what was lost was not obedience, it was emotional investment. People no longer interpreted the plantation as permanent. They saw it as a condition, one that could change, erode, or be survived without internal collapse. The shift altered everything. Work became transactional. Relationships with authority became procedural. Fear became manageable. The plantation still functioned, but only because those within it allowed it to, selectively, temporarily, on their own terms. And that is not power. That is tolerance. What authority failed to understand was that tolerance is finite. It does not reproduce loyalty. It does not build legacy. It does not sustain institutions. The estate began to age poorly. Infrastructure decayed faster than expected. Oversight gaps widened. Efficiency never recovered. There were no records explaining why. On paper, everything appeared intact. But beneath the surface, something essential had migrated elsewhere. Into memory, into shared understanding, into the way people oriented themselves toward the future. Even those who never left the plantation carried that shift forward. They passed it down subtly. Through caution. Through advice. Through warnings delivered without explanation. Watch carefully. Do only what's necessary. Don't show more than required. These were not revolutionary messages. They were survival ones. And they endured. The plantation's greatest failure, in the end, was assuming that control over bodies ensured control over meaning. It did not. Meaning moved freely. It lived in interpretation. It survived in silence. Long after authority lost its grip, long after its punishments became rituals rather than threats, what remained was a population that no longer believed in the inevitability of domination. They understood its mechanics. They understood its limits. They understood that power, once questioned internally, never fully recovers. This understanding did not lead to chaos. It led to patience, to endurance, to a future shaped quietly, incrementally, beyond the plantation's reach. Authority eventually faded, not in a single moment but through irrelevance. It continued issuing commands to people who had already learned how to live without internal compliance. What survived was not rebellion. It was clarity. And clarity, once inherited, does not disappear. It waits. It adapts. It outlives the systems that try to suppress it. That was the plantation's greatest failure. Not that it was seen, but that it was understood and remembered.